Hey guys, welcome to Kidmissing TV. I am your host, sorry about that, Angelina Wilson. This is the case of the Klein brothers. The Klein brothers, Kenneth Jr., 8, David, 6, and Danny, 4, vanished. In a North Minneapolis park, Minneapolis, Minnesota, November of 1951. Their mother, Betty, never stopped looking for her boys. No bodies were ever found, and multiple tips and leads were followed up on, yet there are still no definitive answers for what is one of the saddest unsolved mysteries in the United States, and one of the oldest in Minnesota, I believe. Detective Jessica Miller took the case in 2012. She believes she knows their fate. She was asked if she thinks they were murdered. She said, "I do." The family leaned towards them being abducted and raised elsewhere. We have no evidence either way, but the chance of them being alive is slim. Her and her partner, Detective Miller, her and her partner, Detective Lance Sauls, have identified a prime suspect, Lloyd Paddock, and his home as a possible burial place. The current owners of the home do not want missing persons detectives digging in their basement, even though they will pay for any damages. I would want to know if 3 little boys' bodies were buried in my basement. Which is exactly what Detective Miller said. Both parents died without knowing. They had another child, Donald, after the tragedy. The Sun newspaper has a quote from him: "Every time she, their mother, heard someone coming down the driveway, she thought it was the boys." 2 hats were found next to a frozen lake on that fateful day, but that was it. The area was searched in what has been described as perfect conditions, and still nothing. And police decided they must have drowned. The case was closed after 5 days because they believed no crime had happened. What followed are decades of despair, crushed hope, and frustration for Betty and Kenneth Sr. In 1956, their father said, "We know they are alive," to the Sunday Tribune in Minneapolis. They never stopped believing until their dying day. The boys were always on their mind, said Donald, who recalled how his parents, Betty, who passed away in 2012, and Kenneth in 2004, would always ensure one of them was at home just in case the brothers suddenly appeared. The surviving brothers would keep the faith too. We inherited our parents' hope, Donald said. Oldest brother Gordon said, I lost my childhood. He said to Jack L. Hay, who wrote a book about the case and produced a 6-part podcast series called Long Lost. Gordon forever blamed himself for their disappearance, as he stayed at home on that fateful day instead of accompanying them to the park, but hoped they were alive and perhaps living with another family. Somewhere. A few men came forward believing they had been abducted as children, although unfortunately DNA tests didn't match up with the Kleins. Again, Paddock, the key suspect, lived near the family. He filled his basement with concrete shortly after their disappearance. Despite a number of red flags, he was never questioned because, again, police believed a Pandora's box was opened when Detective Miller started speaking to the mother, and something just didn't seem right. When human remains were found in Wright County in a gravel pit, the bones weren't a match. And that's what opened Pandora's box for the detective. She asked the Kleins if any DNA had been submitted to the missing persons database. No. Her and her partner went through 60 years of dead ends, got DNA in the database. It was a winter day. They were dressed in layer upon layer. Okay. In 2016, after a lot of hard work, Detectives Miller and Sells finally convinced the police department in Minneapolis and the FBI to reopen the case. And they got the DNA in the database. They have zero physical evidence. I wonder if they ever tried to get foreign DNA or fingerprints off the hats. The detective in 1996, Sergeant Jim Schultz, um, was able to say for certain that the parents were not involved. Um, he didn't think anyone would ever carry on his work, but he had his work. So, when Detectives Miller and Sauls called on him, he said, "Yeah, here you go." And she said it was like Christmas Day. Um, I know they weren't in the river. I would bet my house on it, he said. He said the decision to close the case after 5 days was grievous, in quotes. Two suspects shot to the top of the list: Paddock, who we mentioned, and a Richard Fosse. He and Paddock invited people to come over and help him with the basement. And when they came the next day, he said, "Oh, all done." Which rang alarm bells for everybody. Like, wait a minute. So you worked all night so we would be here? What's going on? You know? And it was backbreaking work because in the 50s you had to mix the concrete yourself. They didn't have a concrete truck to pour it down a chute into your basement. People who worked in the industry at the time said there's no way one person could have finished that job. He also replaced some wood planks in his truck. His behavior really stood out to police. Okay. Interestingly, the other suspect, Fosse, who left the area soon after their disappearance. In 1955, he was linked to the murder of three boys in Chicago. That would be Peterson Schuessler. The owner of some stables was convicted of the crime, but Fosse was accused of helping with the cleanup operation. And their oldest brother said it was always believed it was someone from the park. He told El Hay, the author and podcaster. They saw an opportunity, they took the boys and sold them. And the Klein boys would have known both suspects. A few days after the disappearance, there was a postcard sent to the family, anonymously, demanding $15,000 for the return of the boys. Kenneth Sr. and the FBI turned up at the spot in Princeton, Minnesota, 70 miles from Minneapolis, yet no one was there. Five years later, another family suggested a male neighbor would often meet with the boys and take them to a nearby cave on the banks of the Mississippi. There were many camps, however, staged along the river, and so although toys and other items were found, any links to the case were dismissed. Okay. This is sad. Betty and Kenneth Sr. hired a private investigator who concluded the kids had been lured by two local men. A story given to them by a terminally ill woman by the name of Eva DeBoer, who, in her dying days, decided to speak out about the abuse suffered by her own daughter at the hands of one of the suspects. She says she saw them playing basketball with the two men the day they went missing. They wondered about adoption rings. I think they were a little old for what someone like a what's her name? I'm trying to think of her name. The one in Tennessee, there was one in California. I think they're a little old for that. Maybe not the youngest. How old were they? Okay, the youngest one was 4. The other two were 8 and 6. That might be a little old for those adoption schemes. And another private investigator hired by the family in the mid-2000s barely did anything and proceeded to lose the only scraps of evidence, 3 boxes of personal effects. Detective Miller said, quote, "That was heartbreaking. It's like someone came into the house and hauled them away," claimed Gordon. "It's a bad thing." Their youngest brother said at the end of the podcast, quote, "I don't want my brothers forgotten when I die." Again, they disappeared on November 10th, 1951. They lived in the 2900 block of Colfax Avenue. They left there at 1:30 in the afternoon to go to the park at Lyndale and 29th Street, 4 blocks away. One of their brothers supposedly posted on Web Sleuths in 2017 saying that he always suspected a next-door neighbor, he says, was a person of interest. He also accuses the police of being totally incompetent. I cannot disagree with that. Um, I will link the podcast. I will link the book. They found toilet seats and all kinds of trash in the river when they lowered it. It was perfectly clear. They would have been found if they were there. And the dogs tracked the boys 3 times, not always to the river, but always near the North Side Police Station, which must have been near the park. The case over the years had been kept alive by retired officers, investigators, sleuths, writers, and occasionally reporters. But the police claim they have no idea where the boxes of files went. Well, hopefully with what Detectives Miller and Salas were able to come up with, they've been able to put a case together. Okay. He talks about his mother when cars would slow down and she would think it might be one of her boys, and then there would be tears when it wasn't. This makes what the Minneapolis police and other agencies have done or not done all these years all the more wrong to me personally, he said. No wonder Minneapolis has an ugly history of human trafficking. Well, that's very interesting. For all the wrong reasons. If you have any information in this case, no matter how small you may think it is, you can call the Minneapolis Police Department, who are finally actually doing their jobs. Lieutenant Reinhardt, Reinhardt, 612-673-2853. That's 612-673-2853. Case number 16-127633. That's 16-127633. Does that burn at anybody else's bottom that they did that? I'm just so grateful for, Detectives Miller and Salas for really digging into it, because if they hadn't dug into it, it wouldn't be reopened. Those boys didn't drown in a frozen river. Everything was frozen. For those of you not familiar with Minnesota, now, okay, I live in Massachusetts, and it's pretty cold. Like, absolutely bone-numbing cold um, that time of year here. Sometimes we have some pretty wacky weather, so sometimes it can be all of a sudden 65 degrees. Um, but in Minnesota, they're right on the border with Canada. Minnesota is, I believe, the coldest state. I could be wrong. It could be one of the Dakotas or Montana, but Minnesota is one of the coldest, if not the coldest. November 10th would have been absurdly cold, obscenely cold. And obviously it was, because they were described as being layered up and layered up. First of all, if they fell in the lake with that many layers, chances are their jackets would have acted as a flotation device. You know, a lot of people think with all that weight on, you'd just sink like a rock. No. A lot of winter coats will act as a flotation device. And because the water is at a certain temperature, you will survive longer. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but the cold water, even though it can cause a heart attack and kill you instantly, it can also save your life in the sense that at a certain temperature, even if you're drowning and you're under the water, everything's going to slow down because it's so cold and all your blood vessels are squeezing. And even if you're found a ways after, the hypothermia will protect you from brain damage from drowning. So we have to keep those things in our minds when talking about this case. In any case where the police think that a kid drowned in the winter in the tundra up there, even here in the wintertime, most of the time. Now, up there, they're in the well below zeros. For us, here in New England, well, in Massachusetts, southern New England, the well below zeros are not common. They do happen. For us, it's going to be after dark. Usually, when the below zeros hit, is after dark. And if they hit during the day here, it's a phenomenon called radiational cooling, which I'm sure that they have as well, which is when there's a beautiful blue sky and no clouds in the wintertime, but it is colder than comprehension. And I remember asking my dad about that. Dad, it's such a beautiful day. Why is it so cold? That's when he explained the phenomenon of radiational cooling. If there's no clouds, there's nothing holding any kind of heat. If there's clouds, the clouds are holding a little bit of warmth, so it's not as cold as it is when there's no clouds in the sky. That's radiational cooling, because there's nowhere for any heat to be held on to. And it is brutal cold. So those are the only times that we'll dip below zero, is radiational cooling, when there's no clouds, and nighttime. Nighttime here it's brutal in the wintertime. And I'm sure up there it's also brutal in the wintertime at night. I'm sure the searchers were freezing their tuchuses off searching at night, you know, as it got to be late afternoon. Because you got to remember, it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And yes, they're in Central Time, but it doesn't matter. It still gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, um, the temperature is going to drop. The mercury's going to drop when there's no more sun. So, um, I would like to credit my father for this and for explaining things to me before he passed on, and leaving it to me, leaving the knowledge with me to be able to do this episode with some knowledge. I can't thank him enough for that. I was very blessed to do that. I was blessed to have him, and I was blessed to have gotten to learn from him. And I do consider myself lucky. So, and I hope I taught you something. So, this is going to be a longer one for a kid missing. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll see you Wednesday. Bye, guys.